Israel is running out of time to save itself from the consequences of a massive ground invasion in Gaza. Well, I think it's certainly headed in that direction. I don't know if it already has. We have to listen to what the Russian ambassador had to say in the United Nations, as well as other leaders in the region. We have to note the recent meeting between the foreign ministers of Turkey and Iran, and then between the Iranian foreign minister and Mr. Erdogan. All of these things have an ominous tone about them. That doesn't mean that everything is about to fall on Israel immediately. But I think we're headed in that direction, and it doesn't appear that anyone in Washington is interested in halting the rush into disaster. Was one of Hamas's goals on October 7th to induce an overreaction from Israel to coalesce Arab animosity in the region against it? Well, it's not unreasonable to make that point, but we haven't talked to anyone in Hamas. We don't know what their intentions happen to be, but if that wasn't their intention, it certainly turned out to be that way. Is the Israeli military walking into a trap by attempting to wage a land war in a place as treacherous, as urban, and as filled with tunnels and old buildings as Gaza is? I think so. I would say on many levels. If we go back to the summer of last year when the war in Ukraine was changing or evolving and the world's attention was fixed almost exclusively on what was happening there, had the Israelis confronted Hamas at that point, I think they would have had an easier time waging this sort of ruthless scorched earth campaign against Hamas than they have right now. It's simply a function of the fact that the world is not looking at Ukraine because the war in Ukraine is effectively over. The losses and destruction in Ukraine are horrendous, and Ukrainians can't do much about it. So everyone is focused now on Israel, and they're seeing things that upset them. You cannot broadcast the pictures of dead children being carried out of the rubble in Gaza without expecting some sort of horrendous national reaction from each of the Arab states and from the so-called Arab Street. So that's definitely part of it, and on another level, I think that the region is increasingly coalescing into this alliance that might have otherwise never occurred. There's a readiness to take action, there's no doubt about it, against the Israelis, and we, again, are the loyal, obedient servants of Mr. Netanyahu and his government. Mr. Erdogan's rantings and ravings before 1 million people, whatever the size of that crowd was, are to be taken as domestic political purposes or in preparation for support for military activity. Both. There's no question about it, I think both are accurate. Mr. Erdogan is a clever, manipulative politician if ever there was one, but he's also a very powerful nationalist in the Turkish sense and widely respected inside his country for nothing else but his strength in leading Turkey. In fact, you could say that in many ways, he's regarded by many Turks in this as a strong leader the way many Israelis regarded Mr. Netanyahu. I think he's deadly serious, and for the Turks to hold these meetings with the Iranians in public, they've always had meetings privately from time to time, but for these meetings to be so public is a very, very important signal to the world. Why do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't take note of this or, if he takes note of it, isn't acting upon it? My view is that his situation politically at home is so precarious, he only stays in office for as long as the war is being waged, and the minute the war is over, he's out of office and maybe out of freedom. But I would think if Iran and Turkey are cooking something up, and with Erdogan riling up the masses, Netanyahu should take note of it and perhaps do something like pull the troops back or let humanitarian aid in. So my question is, if there's a ceasefire, who wins or who's perceived as winning? I don't know that there will be any winners if there is an immediate ceasefire. In other words, something happens right away. It'll take time to sort out, but I think whatever happens will work to Israel's disadvantage strategically. I think Mr. Netanyahu, and by the way, I haven't met him, I don't know him, I've read other people's assessments but I can't evaluate him personally, but I think that he is a ferocious fighter for Israel, there's no question about that. But I also think he's got us in a position where I think he believes this is the time to leverage American national power to try and settle accounts if he can do it with his neighbors, and he is focused on that almost to the exclusion of everything else. We are giving him unconditional support on the assumption that he is going to be successful, that he will go and root out Hamas, destroy the place, and that he can get that done before anything else happens. We put our force there as a stopgap measure in the event that Hezbollah attacks. I think it will. I don't know the timing, but I think they ultimately will do that so that we can extract Hezbollah from interfering with what Mr. Netanyahu is trying to do further south. And I think that's it. I think that's all there is right now. And many, many Israelis have complained that they don't see any other strategic end state other than Hamas is destroyed and Gaza is in ruins. That's not the kind of strategic end state that you want unless you want another war. That's the problem. Here's Prime Minister Netanyahu, cut 2, Chris, saying that Israel will never agree to a ceasefire. I want to make clear Israel's position regarding the ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terror attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Ceasefire calls. Our calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to terrorism, to barbarism, that will not happen. To me, that is just demagoguery. They could stop fighting for 48 hours and let water, food, fuel, and medical supplies in. Well, I think that's true, but there's something else here. We're hearing constant references to the Second World War. Yes, we destroyed Germany. Yes, we destroyed Japan. And the result was a 50-year Cold War with the Soviet Union because we had to spend money and raise forces to fill the vacuums created strategically with the destruction of both Japan and Germany. There were voices in the British General Staff, voices in our own, that warned there is a reason why Japan should survive, and there are reasons why the Germans need to survive. Right. We don't want Hitler. We don't like the militarists in Japan. But these two states have an important role to play in Eurasia, on the periphery of Eurasia. Don't destroy them or we'll end up holding the bag. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is taking these things and he really wants us to help him do to his enemies in the region what we did to Japan, even if it requires the use of a weapon of mass destruction. I don't think that's in our interest. And I think the longer this lasts and the more Americans look at this, the more they will question the wisdom of this sort of thing. By the way, Lindsey Graham made essentially the same comments as Mr. Netanyahu. So, they're on the same sheet of music. They sure are. Thank God he's not in the White House, or we would have started World War III by bombing Tehran. Here's Secretary Austin on providing all the security assistance to Israel, and woe to anybody that stands in our way. We're flowing security assistance into Israel at the speed of war. We're providing air defense capabilities, precision-guided munitions, small-diameter bombs, and other key equipment, including more interceptors for the life-saving Iron Dome system. Let's run number 5 as well. You'll like this. General, bold American leadership, our colonel. In both Israel and Ukraine, democracies are fighting ruthless foes who are out to annihilate them. We will not let Hamas or Putin win. Today's battles against aggression and terrorism will define global security for years to come, and only firm American leadership can ensure that tyrants, thugs, and terrorists are not emboldened to commit more aggression and more atrocities. This is similar to what he said, and many others were critical when he said, we can project power on 2 fronts, meaning Israel and Ukraine. Does he know what he's talking about? Well, as far as the 2-front solution that he's discussing, no, he doesn't. He's completely out of touch with reality. He's simply reading from the script handed to him by the White House and by Secretary Blinken. This is very disturbing in the sense that we are not simply overreaching. We have gotten onto this one-way street that is ultimately a dead end. Mr. Netanyahu is correct. It's his way or the highway. Either we kill all of the enemies of Israel that pop up over the wall, or we fail. There is no future force. It reminds me of the German government statements after the fall of Stalingrad, where they said, "This is the year of decision. We're going to destroy all of our enemies and secure victory." We all know what happened. It was the opposite, and ultimately, Germany was doomed at that point. So, I think it's very similar. I don't see it leading anywhere good. So no, I think Mr. Netanyahu has got us where he wants us, and we're going to ride down the hill with him, and at the bottom is an abyss. At the risk of getting off onto Ukraine, we're going to play a clip showing you just how absent from reality Secretary Austin is. Cut 4. Yet, even as we surge support into Israel, we remain focused on Ukraine. Nearly 20 months into Putin's failed campaign of conquest, the Russian military has been badly weakened. Ukraine's brave forces have taken back more than half of the territory seized by Russian invaders since February 2022. And that was made possible by bipartisan and principled U.S. leadership in our coalition of some 50 allies and partners. Colonel, that's not a political speech. He's under oath to tell the truth. Nothing that he just said, I submit, is truthful. No, it isn't. And I don't know what map he's examining. Perhaps he, too, is being subjected to the mushroom treatment kept in a cave and fed. It reminds me of Trotsky, who was approached by one of his colleagues when Trotsky printed things for distribution inside the Soviet Union in 1920 that were utterly false. And he said, "Comrade, paper will put up with anything you put on it." It seems that both the internet and television will put up with anything that's posted on it. And he could not be more wrong, and again, this sort of dangerous fantasy, this sense of limitless resources and capabilities when the opposite is the case. Our resources and archives are not limitless, and we don't want to squander them unnecessarily. By the way, the same thing is true for Israel. Both Israel and the United States need to think first and foremost about their survival and national power. You don't do anything that puts that at risk. And that's what we're doing. And Mr. Netanyahu is doing that. It's sort of like Hitler saying, I'm going to invade the Soviet Union. I'm going to risk everything on one throw of the dice. That's insane. You don't throw dice in strategy. How dangerous would it be for peace in the region if American troops, Marines, or special forces were to be on the ground in Gaza? Well, the danger is that if they go in any numbers to Israel and they meet the enemy, that obviously they'll take losses. If there are severe losses, if there's more than a few at a time, not only will that awaken the American public from its normal slumber at home, but more importantly, it would reveal that we are once again not invincible, not invulnerable. And one of the things that, despite all of the stupidity in Ukraine that still exists, is our brand. We still have a pretty good brand despite all the problems. That brand will be destroyed if people think, look, the Americans have come into this, and they've lost aircraft. They've lost troops. Gee, they're not that good. They're not that strong. That encourages more enemies to pile on. Again, that's why unless there's a vital strategic interest at stake, you don't commit forces that could be defeated. Do your sources inform you about whether there have been American military casualties in Gaza? Yes, I was told that by a couple of very reliable sources who have to remain anonymous. They insisted some time ago that we had put people on the ground in Israel. They described them as special ops forces. They could be from the Army or the Marines, obviously, and they were working with or cooperating closely. In some cases, they were there to observe and learn lessons. Some of them have been involved in the fighting, and I'm told that we've taken casualties. But you know, we took casualties in Ukraine as well, Judge. We've lost people over there, and we have not been told about it. It has been suppressed and kept secret, and the media has been very helpful to the government in doing this. So, I surmise that they're probably right. We've probably taken some losses. But no one is going to advertise it for fear that it would awaken people. Remember, Americans are not really paying that much attention to what happens overseas. I wish they were, but they're not. I must strenuously suggest that the American public has the right to know when the President of the United States is putting troops on the ground, and some of them are coming back in body bags. Even if they're not coming back in body bags, we have the right to know when he's putting troops on the ground or using the military in any respect. Yeah, again, this is not December 1944 or January 1945. We took tremendous losses in the Battle of the Bulge. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 114,000 casualties fighting the Germans. The Germans only sustained 68,000, of which only 11,000 were killed. We solved the problem during the war by lying. We said the Germans had lost 200,000 and that we had only suffered 70,000. In other words, we didn't tell the truth. Well, we were in the middle of a war, and Americans were very unhappy with how lengthy the war was turning out to be, and a lot of Americans wanted us to bring our forces home. We're not in that situation. We're not in a world war. So, if we're taking losses and our forces are on the ground, yes, you're right. We need to know so that people can make their voices heard. They can call and say, we don't approve. We don't like it. Well, if we're in Netanyahu's pocket and he wants troops there and doesn't want the world to know about it, I suppose old Joe Biden will try and keep it secret. Well, you know, Judge, there's one other thing here to consider, and that is we have a bad habit of piecemealing. If you're going to commit your military power to a specific objective in support, for instance, of Israel, go to the American people. Make the case and say, in order to ensure Israel's long-term survival and security strategically, I am committing the power of the United States to defeat Israel's enemies. We're not doing that, though. We're sitting on the margins, we're playing a game, we're misinforming the American people, we're pretending that we can do more than we can do. In other words, either come clean, tell the truth, and commit, or don't. But this halfway house is dangerous for the reasons that I outlined. The news slips, it leaks out, we find out, and people are angry and say, "Why are you doing this?" Can Israel defeat Hamas? I don't think that Hamas can be systematically erased. Look, half the leadership is not even in Gaza. So, you can fight and eventually kill most of the fighters, of which there are maybe 30 or 40,000 left, I suspect, up in the city itself. It's going to be long and tiresome. It's going to cost casualties. It's going to cost a lot of time. But yeah, I think it can probably be done, provided you don't care about the losses that are taken by non-combatants. And I think it's important that people like Lindsey Graham and Mr. Netanyahu tend to regard anyone who is in the vicinity of the Hamas fighters as effectively combatants. So if you're there, you shouldn't be there. That's why you're being killed. I don't think that's a good solution in today's world. I don't think it's something they'll get away with, but I mean that's obviously the attitude. So they dropped 6 bombs on a refugee camp to kill one lost leader, and they killed between 200 and 300 hopeless, helpless, homeless refugees and claimed that was consistent with the laws of war, that the refugees were collateral damage. I don't think any rational person, other than those blinded by ideology, fear, rage, or any other emotion you want to take into account, could make that argument. Well, etc. Churchill made that argument to justify the bombings of Dresden, right? It's not a new phenomenon, and for Churchill, it was total war with Germany, and he didn't give a damn about what that ultimately meant until it was too late, by the way. And Mr. Netanyahu is taking the same position. I don't buy that, and the problem that I have with it is that no one is stating why it is in our interest for the United States to apply its power, prestige, and influence to kill all of Israel's enemies, because Hamas is not the only enemy. And as each day passes, as we started discussing this, the enemies are multiplying. Chris, run the clip, please, of Alistair Crook. We both know Alistair. Here's what he told me just 2 days ago. We don't trust the army. We just do not trust the government at all. We can't come back. Think that view is shared by most Israelis towards Prime Minister Netanyahu and his extremist government? I think the majority of Israelis, whatever that majority is, that's perhaps 60%, perhaps it's 55%, that majority feels that what Mr. Netanyahu is doing is both justified and necessary. So, I don't think the Israelis have lost complete confidence in the government. What's always amazing to me is the routine of how we routinely lie to the American people. When I say we, I'm talking about Washington about a whole range of things. And the American people tend to be very forgiving. 6 weeks later, they're listening with great attention to what comes out of the Pentagon or the White House, and they're believing it. Which is very strange to me. So, I don't think it's completely gone. What I don't know is whether or not they have been moved or will be made available to protect Hezbollah, and again, what happens when Hezbollah is attacked? It'll do enormous damage, but what happens when it's attacked? Do the Iranians sit quietly on the sidelines, or do they flow into Iraq and Syria and try to finish our forces off there? Will the Iranians launch missiles from there all the way to Israel? I mean, we have no way of knowing. And then, finally, what will the Turks do? The Turks, quite frankly, have never gotten along with Mr. Assad, but Mr. Assad is very weak. It may be that the Russians tell Mr. Assad to stand aside. If the Turks want to move through Syria to attack Israel, then let them go. The Turks have long said Syria is a Turkish province for all intents and purposes anyway. So, this whole thing is unraveling. I think at a very high speed. We're not seeing it because we're not being informed. We're not being told about it. Egypt is another one. Mr. Sisi's position with each passing day weakens. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is very close to the Turks and Mr. Erdogan, and their blood is up. They will desperately go in and protect the Arabs in Gaza. We don't really know what's happening on the West Bank. We don't know what kinds of discussions are going on behind the scenes to prompt a full-scale rebellion there. This whole thing, we're seeing literally the tip of an iceberg strategically, and the real iceberg, the mammoth threat to Israel and, frankly, to our influence in the region and power in the region, is beneath the surface. No one's talking about it. Instead, we get these ridiculous statements that absolutely are groundless from Secretary Austin or Blinken or the President saying, oh, we can do anything. Our resources are endless. We're stronger than ever. We cannot. That's the truth. Colonel, thank you very much for your time.